The fine notice was taped to my front door on the worst morning of the year. Not metaphorically. Literally the worst morning of the year. We were in the middle of a full-blown blizzard, the kind where the weather service sends out emergency alerts telling people to stay home, the kind where schools close 2 days in advance, the kind where you look out your window and genuinely cannot see where your driveway ends and your neighbor's yard begins. There was 18 inches of snow on the ground already, another 8 to 12 forecasted before noon, wind chills pushing it to -15, and roads so iced over that the county had pulled its own plow trucks off the highway because the drivers couldn't see a thing. And right there, stuck to my front door with what appeared to be entirely too much packing tape, was a bright yellow notice from the Maplewood Glen Homeowners Association, informing me that I, Jack Bennett, had been fined $150 for leaving an unauthorized personal item on my front porch in violation of Section 7, subsection 4B of the Community Guidelines. The unauthorized personal item. My snow boots. My snow boots that I had worn approximately 45 minutes earlier to dig out my car. My snow boots that were caked in snow and ice and salt because I had been shoveling through a blizzard. My snow boots that I had left on the porch mat for the same reason every rational human being leaves wet boots on a porch in a snowstorm, which is that you do not want to track 2 pounds of icy slush through your entire house. My snow boots that, by the way, had been on that porch for less than an hour before someone decided they were enough of a community eyesore to warrant a $150 fine. I stood there in my socks, holding that yellow paper, feeling the cold air from the open door biting at my ankles, staring at this notice like it might explain itself further if I looked at it long enough. It did not. It just said fine notice at the top, had my address, had the amount, had a reference to the guidelines section, and was signed at the bottom in loopy cursive by Wanda Dennison, HOA Violations Coordinator. Wanda Dennison. Of course it was Wanda Dennison. I need to give you some background on Wanda before this story goes any further, because understanding Wanda Dennison is really the key to understanding everything that happened over the next few days. Wanda had moved into Maplewood Glen about 4 years before I did, which meant she had a 1-year head start on establishing herself in the community before I arrived. In that 1 year, she had somehow managed to get herself appointed to the HOA board as Violations Coordinator, which is a position I am fairly confident she invented herself because I have never seen it listed in any HOA organizational structure in my life. She had a house directly across the street from mine, which meant she had a perfect line of sight to my front porch, my driveway, my mailbox, my yard, and essentially the entire front-facing surface of my life. She was in her mid-50s, drove a silver Lexus SUV that she kept so aggressively clean it looked like it had never actually been outside, and she treated the HOA rulebook the way some people treat a religious text, with total devotion and absolutely zero sense of proportion or context. In the 2 years I had lived in Maplewood Glen, Wanda had fined me 4 times. Once for having my trash cans visible from the street for more than 12 hours after pickup, which happened because I had been traveling for work, and a neighbor pulled my cans back but didn't get them quite to the right spot. Once for a holiday wreath I had left on my door 2 days past the approved holiday decoration end date, which was January 2nd, because apparently January 3rd is when wreaths become a neighborhood blight. Once for parking my truck in the driveway at an angle that she claimed encroached on the visual property line, which is not a real thing. And now this, $150 fine for snow boots during a blizzard. I went back inside, put on a fresh pair of socks, made myself a cup of coffee, and sat down at my kitchen table with that yellow paper and my laptop. The wind was howling outside. I could hear snow hitting the windows like sand. My furnace was running almost constantly trying to keep up. I had nowhere to go because every road in the county was closed or strongly advised against, which meant I had absolutely nothing but time to deal with this. First, I pulled up the HOA governing documents. I had downloaded them when I first moved in because I like to know what I am signing up for, and I had updated the file when they issued a revised version 8 months ago. Section 7, subsection 4B, I found it. I read it, then I read it again. Here is what it actually said, word for word. Homeowners shall not store personal belongings, furniture, recreational equipment, or decorative items on front-facing porches, stoops, or entryways in a manner that is permanent or semi-permanent in nature, or in a manner that creates a visual nuisance for neighboring properties. That's it. That's the whole subsection. Permanent or semi-permanent. Visual nuisance. My boots had been on the porch for less than an hour, during a blizzard, when literally no one could see them because visibility was about 30 feet, and my porch was covered in snow anyway. I could feel the calm, focused kind of anger settling in, the kind that does not make you want to yell, but makes you want to build a case brick by brick until there is no possible way out for the other person. I had been here before with Wanda. Not this exact situation, but the general vibe. I knew that getting emotional with her got you nowhere. She fed on that. She used it to paint you as the unreasonable one. What she could not handle was documentation and rules, because the second you turned her own rulebook against her, she had nothing left. I started a new document on my laptop and titled it internally as the Wanda file, version 5. I pulled up the National Weather Service advisory that had been issued at 6 a.m. that morning. It was a winter storm warning, the highest level, with language specifically recommending that residents avoid all unnecessary travel and take emergency precautions. I saved that as a screenshot. I then pulled up the county emergency management page, which was currently advising all non-essential workers to stay home and warning that road conditions were life-threatening. Saved that too. Then I opened Google Maps satellite view and looked at my address, noting that my front porch was fully enclosed on 3 sides and only visible from the street, which meant the only person who would realistically be able to see my boots was someone who was specifically looking at my porch, from directly across the street. Like, say, someone with a Lexus SUV and a violations coordinator title. Then I did something I had been meaning to do for a while, but had not gotten around to after the parking angle incident. I went and checked my own security camera footage. I had installed a Ring-style doorbell camera about 6 months earlier, mostly because of some package theft in the area. The camera covered my front porch and part of my driveway. I pulled up the footage on my phone and started going back through the morning's recordings. And what I found made me set down my coffee mug very slowly and carefully, the way you do when you have just been handed something much better than you expected. At 7:14 a.m., the camera recorded me stepping outside in my snow boots, grabbing my shovel, and starting to clear the driveway. The snow was absolutely hammering down. You could see it in the footage, thick and heavy and near whiteout conditions. At 8:22 a.m., I came back up the porch steps, knocked my boots against the porch railing to shake off the packed snow, set them on the mat next to the door, and went inside. At 8:51 a.m., exactly 29 minutes after my boots appeared on the porch, a figure appeared at the edge of the frame. It was Wanda Dennison, wrapped in what appeared to be a floor-length parka and fur-lined boots that probably cost more than my fine, walking across the street directly toward my porch through what I can only describe as genuinely dangerous snowfall. She looked at the boots. She took out her phone and took a photo of them. She then walked back across the street, and 22 minutes later the fine notice appeared on my door. Wanda Dennison had walked through a blizzard to photograph my snow boots. Think about that for a second. Emergency alerts on every device in the county telling people to stay inside. Roads that the plow trucks had given up on. Wind chill at -15. And this woman put on her coat and physically crossed the street in those conditions to document that I had left my boots on my porch mat. I was honestly a little awed, not in a good way, but awed nonetheless. I saved the entire camera footage segment to my phone and emailed it to myself as a backup. I also started writing a formal response letter to the HOA addressing the fine. I know, most people would just pay it and move on, or call Wanda and get into a screaming match that accomplishes nothing. I'm not that person. I have read enough HOA horror stories and enough general civil law to know that HOAs are not kings. They have to follow their own rules. They have to operate within state law, and when they do not, they expose themselves to real consequences. And in my state, which I will not name because it does not matter to the story, HOA fines have to meet a few specific criteria to be enforceable. Among them is the requirement that the violation cited must constitute an ongoing or substantive breach of the community standards, not a temporary or incidental condition. A pair of boots left on a porch mat during a blizzard for less than 30 minutes before a fine notice was issued is about as temporary and incidental as it gets. I wrote the letter. It was 2 pages. It referenced the specific subsection language. It explained the timeline established by my camera footage. It included the weather advisory information and noted that the conditions made the visibility argument moot and also made the circumstances extraordinary by any reasonable standard. It requested that the fine be rescinded within 14 days and noted that if it was not, I would be pursuing further remedies including a formal dispute hearing as provided under the HOA's own bylaws, Article 9, Section 2, which I had also been reading. I printed it, signed it, put it in an envelope, and then sat it on my kitchen counter because obviously I could not drive anywhere in this weather to get it stamped and mailed. But it was ready. While I was doing all of this, the snow kept falling. By mid-morning I had closer to 2 feet on the ground, and my back deck had completely disappeared under a drift. I had to run my kitchen faucets at a trickle because the pipes along the north wall were starting to feel questionable in this cold, something I had learned the hard way during my first winter in this house. I had 3 space heaters running as backup to the furnace, which was working overtime and making the low groaning sound it made when it was genuinely stressed. I had about a week's worth of groceries because I had read the forecast and done a full run on Wednesday, unlike apparently some of my neighbors judging by the panicked texts in the neighborhood group chat asking if anyone had extra bread or milk. The neighborhood group chat. Right. That became relevant. Our Maplewood Glen group chat had about 60 of the 80 households in the community on it. It was mostly used for lost pet alerts, the occasional complaint about speeding on the main road through the development, updates when someone spotted a coyote, and approximately every 4 months or so, a drama thread involving Wanda Dennison and whoever she had most recently decided to fine for something. At around 11 that morning, after I had calmed down and was on my second cup of coffee watching snow pile up against my living room window, I posted in the chat. I kept it factual and calm. I said something like, just got a $150 fine notice for leaving snow boots on my porch mat this morning. Boots were out for less than 30 minutes during the blizzard, immediately after I finished shoveling. Notice was signed by Wanda Dennison. Has anyone else gotten a fine today or recently for something that seems like it doesn't match the actual rule language? And then I went and made myself breakfast. My phone exploded. Within 30 minutes, I had over 40 responses. Some were just reactions, laugh emojis or disbelief gifs or the skull emoji. But several were from other homeowners sharing their own recent fine experiences. And what started emerging was a pattern that made the back of my neck feel hot in a way that had nothing to do with the space heaters. 3 other people had gotten fines in the past 2 months that they had either quietly paid or argued briefly about, and then let go. One person, a guy named Derek who lived 4 houses down from me, had been fined $200 for having a crack in his driveway that, by his description, was about 3 inches long and had appeared after a hard freeze. He paid it because the notice said failure to pay within 30 days resulted in an additional administrative fee. A woman named Patricia had been fined $75 for her mailbox post being, and I quote from her text, slightly leaning due to frost heave, which is something that happens to literally every mailbox post in the northern United States every single winter because the ground freezes and shifts. Patricia had also paid it. Another neighbor, an older gentleman named Ted, who I had spoken to maybe twice, but who seemed sharp as a tack, sent a longer message saying he had been fined twice in the past year for things that, when he went back and read the actual rule language, he genuinely could not reconcile with the cited violations. He had a background in bookkeeping, he said, and he had been keeping a personal log of the fine activity he was aware of in the neighborhood because something about the pattern felt off to him. When Ted said the pattern felt off, I sent him a private message asking what specifically he meant. His response took about 5 minutes, like he was typing carefully, and then it came through in a block of text that I read 3 times. Ted had been tracking, to the best of his ability, the fine amounts being issued by the HOA and comparing them against the publicly visible portion of the HOA financial records, which in our state had to be made available to members on request. What he had noticed was that the fine revenue listed in the statements did not quite match up with the number of fines he was aware of being issued and the amounts of those fines. He was not an accountant, he said. He was not certain, but the numbers were not lining up in a way he could explain by normal variance. I stared at that message for a long time. I thought about Wanda walking through a blizzard to photograph my boots. I thought about the string of petty fines that seemed disproportionate to the actual rules. I thought about the fine revenue not adding up. And I thought about something a coworker had once said to me, which was that the simplest explanation for why someone is very aggressively doing a thing they have no logical reason to do is usually that they are getting something out of it. I asked Ted if he would be willing to share his log with me. He said he had already emailed it. By early afternoon, the storm had peaked. The wind was doing that thing where it comes in long, sustained roars that shake the windows, and my street was completely invisible under snow. I had not seen a single car move since morning. My neighbor on the left, an older couple named the Garcias, had knocked on my door around noon to ask if I had any rock salt to spare, because their front path was turning into a skating rink. I had a full 50-pound bag I had bought ahead of the storm, so I gave them half and helped them spread it. While we were out there, Mr. Garcia told me he had heard about my fine through the chat and that it was, in his words, an absolute load of garbage, which made me feel better in the simple human way that having someone validate your frustration does. Mrs. Garcia made me come inside for about 20 minutes and have some of the soup she had going on the stove, and while I was sitting at their kitchen table eating what I can only describe as the best chicken tortilla soup of my adult life, she told me that she had heard from another neighbor that Wanda had been talking at the most recent HOA board meeting about potentially raising the administrative fee structure for violations. That meeting had been 2 months ago. None of the residents who had been fined had been notified of any proposed fee changes in writing, which was required under the HOA bylaws before any fee structure change could take effect. Another thread to pull. I went back home and went back to Ted's spreadsheet. He had done careful, organized work. The columns were clean, the dates were clear, and the discrepancy he had identified was not small. Based on his tracking of known fines in the community over the past 18 months, the fine revenue should have been considerably higher than what was showing in the available financial summary, not by a small rounding difference, by several $1,000s. Now, Ted's tracking was not perfect. He was going by word of mouth and his own observations. There was plenty of room for him to have missed fines he did not know about, but the gap was significant enough that it pointed in one of 2 directions. Either there was a lot of fine activity that no one in the community knew about, which itself would be a problem, or the fine revenue was being reported inaccurately, which was a much bigger problem. In an HOA, the latter can cross the line from administrative negligence into actual financial misconduct, depending on where the money goes and who controls it. I started composing a formal written request for financial records under the governing documents and, more importantly, under my state's HOA transparency statute, which gives members the right to inspect financial records within a defined response period. I made the request broad and specific at the same time. I asked for itemized fine records going back 24 months, fine collection records, the administrative fee account, and the meeting minutes for the past 12 months, including the meeting where the fee structure had apparently been discussed. I also, because I had been sitting inside all day with nothing but time and nervous energy, called the number for my state's HOA regulatory complaint line, which I had Googled after the parking angle incident and bookmarked like a responsible, mildly paranoid person. I got a recording, which made sense because it was a blizzard and also a weekend, but I left a detailed voicemail and sent a follow-up email to the address listed on the website. The snow finally started to ease up around 4 in the afternoon. It did not stop entirely, but it slowed from the kind of heavy, blinding fall that makes you feel like the world is ending to the kind of steady, quiet snowfall that is actually beautiful when you are warm and not stressed. My street still looked like the surface of the moon. No one had plowed it yet. The plow contract for our neighborhood was managed through the HOA, which meant Wanda's board controlled who got called, and when, a fact that suddenly felt more sinister than it had an hour ago. I shoveled my walk again around 5 because the afternoon accumulation had added another 4 or 5 inches since my morning session. While I was out there, I could see Wanda's house across the street. Her driveway had been plowed, not by a person with a shovel but by a machine. Someone with a small plow attachment had cleared it out cleanly. Our street had not been touched by the neighborhood plow service yet, but Wanda's personal driveway was spotless. That detail went into my document. 2 days after the storm, the roads opened up enough to be passable. The county crews had been out around the clock doing the main roads, and by the following morning, most of the secondary streets, including ours, were at least navigable. The HOA plow service finally came through our street on that second day, which felt about 18 hours later than it should have, but at least it happened. I mailed my formal dispute letter and my financial records request by certified mail, return receipt requested, to both the HOA's official address and to Wanda Dennison directly in her capacity as violations coordinator. I kept copies of everything. The response from Wanda came faster than I expected and was more aggressive than I anticipated, which in hindsight told me she was worried. It arrived 4 days after the storm as a single-page letter on official HOA letterhead, and it was not the polite denial I had expected. It was dismissive and slightly threatening. It said my dispute had been reviewed and denied, that the fine stood, that my characterization of the weather conditions as extenuating was not a recognized exception under the community guidelines, and that if I failed to pay within 30 days, the administrative fee of $50 would be added to the balance, which would then be subject to the HOA's lien procedures. The lien procedures. She was threatening a lien on my house over snow boots. And then, almost as a throwaway line at the end, the letter said that my request for financial records was under review and would be responded to within the time allowed by governing documents, which was 60 days. 60 days. The state statute I had cited gave them 21 days. Either she had not looked up the statute and was going by whatever timeline was in the internal documents, or she was trying to buy time and hoping I did not know any better. I knew better. I responded in writing the same day, noting the statutory timeline, and making clear I expected compliance within 21 days as required by law. I also, on the advice of a brief phone consultation I had paid for with a real estate attorney I found through a referral from a friend, sent a second certified letter requesting that the HOA preserve all financial records related to fine collection for the past 36 months, on the basis that I had reason to believe there may be discrepancies that would warrant further review. The attorney, a woman named Cheryl who had exactly the kind of efficient, no-nonsense energy you want in someone you are paying by the hour, told me that the combination of issues I was describing, the potentially improper fine, the timeline discrepancy, and the financial record irregularities, was worth pursuing carefully and that I was doing the right things. By this point, the neighborhood group chat had turned into something of a coordination center. Ted had shared a version of his spreadsheet with several other neighbors, all of whom had started comparing notes more seriously. A woman named Gloria, who it turned out had a background in nonprofit accounting and had served on the HOA board herself 3 years ago before Wanda had essentially made the environment unpleasant enough that she resigned, told the group that what Ted was describing was consistent with one of two scenarios. Either the fine revenue was being underreported to the community, meaning money was coming in but not being fully reflected in the member-facing statements, or the fines were being paid directly somewhere other than the official HOA account. Neither scenario was good. Gloria said she would be willing to submit a parallel financial records request as a second member, which would put more legal pressure on the board to comply and also document that multiple members were raising concerns. I will be honest, I had started this whole thing because I was annoyed about a $150 fine for my boots during a snowstorm. I had not intended to unravel what was starting to look like a genuine financial mess, but here we were. The 21-day deadline for financial records came and went without full compliance. The HOA produced some records, a partial summary that covered about 8 months of the requested period, and was not itemized in the way I had asked for. It was the kind of partial response that is technically something, but is functionally designed to satisfy the letter of compliance while revealing as little as possible. My attorney Cheryl reviewed it and said it was not compliant with the statutory requirements and that I had grounds to file a formal complaint with the state regulatory body, which I did. I also filed a small claims court case to formally dispute the boot fine. I had filled out the paperwork in advance and had everything ready to go. The filing fee was $40, which felt like a reasonable investment. The case was straightforward on the merits, and I wanted it on the record. The small claims date was set for about 6 weeks out. In the meantime, the HOA board called a community meeting, which was announced via email with about a week's notice. The meeting was technically about winter road maintenance and the plow contract, but everyone in the neighborhood group chat knew what was really going to happen there. The meeting was held in the community room of the neighborhood's small amenity building, a converted garage that had a folding table and about 40 mismatched chairs. It was still cold outside, firmly in the single digits that evening, and people came in stomping snow off their boots and wearing the kind of serious expressions that suggested they had been building up things to say for a while. There were about 45 neighbors there, which for an HOA meeting was an extraordinarily high turnout. Normal HOA meetings in Maplewood Glen apparently drew about 8 to 12 people. Wanda was at the front table with 2 other board members, a quiet man named Brian who had the look of someone who had long since given up trying to redirect Wanda and had settled into mild complicity, and a newer woman named Sandra who I had never spoken to and who looked genuinely uncomfortable being there. Wanda herself was composed, sitting very straight, with a folder of papers in front of her and the specific kind of smile that says I am in charge, and I intend to remain in charge. The meeting started with the official agenda item about the plow contract. Wanda presented some information about the current contractor, the costs, the response times during the most recent storm. Someone in the audience pointed out that the street had not been plowed for about 36 hours after the storm ended, which was well outside the response window in the contract. Wanda said the contractor had faced extraordinary conditions. The same person pointed out that Wanda's own driveway, which was not part of the neighborhood plow contract, but had apparently been serviced by a private contractor, had been cleared the morning after the storm while the street was still buried. Wanda said that was a personal arrangement and not relevant to the community contract discussion. That is when I raised my hand and stood up, and the room got very quiet. I had not planned a dramatic speech. I am not really a dramatic speech kind of person. I just had information and I presented it clearly. I explained that I had filed a formal dispute over the snow boot fine and that the case was going to small claims court. I explained that I had also submitted a financial records request under state statute and that the HOA's response had been incomplete and untimely, which had resulted in a regulatory complaint being filed. I then said that several members of the community had been comparing notes, and that there appeared to be a significant discrepancy between the fine revenue that residents were aware of and what had been reported in the member-facing financial summaries. I watched Wanda's expression change as I talked. The composed smile started to get rigid around the edges. Ted stood up and talked about his spreadsheet in calm, clear terms. He had printed copies and passed them down the rows. Gloria stood up and explained what the discrepancy patterns could mean from an accounting standpoint without making direct accusations, which was the right move. She kept it to questions. Where is the detailed fine ledger? Who controls the fee collection account? Has there been an independent audit in the past 3 years? Wanda said audits were conducted annually by the board. Gloria asked who conducted them. Wanda said the board reviewed the accounts internally. Gloria said, very pleasantly, that internal review without an independent party was not an audit in any formal sense, and that the bylaws actually required an independent review every 2 years. And then she produced a copy of the bylaws with that section highlighted and handed it to Sandra, who read it and quietly set it on the table in front of her. The next hour was one of the more remarkable things I have witnessed at a neighborhood meeting. Neighbor after neighbor stood up and shared their own fine experiences, and when you put them all in a row in the same room, the pattern became impossible to dismiss as coincidence. Petty fines, often for things that were either clearly temporary, related to winter weather conditions, or only marginally connected to the actual rule language. Several people said they had just paid the fines because fighting them seemed harder than paying them. A few people had paid multiple fines over the past year. Sandra, the newer board member, had stopped looking uncomfortable and started looking increasingly troubled. At one point she leaned over and said something quietly to Brian, who nodded with the expression of a man who had been waiting for someone else to notice this. Wanda tried to regain control of the meeting several times. She talked about community standards and property values and the importance of consistent enforcement. She cited the rulebook. She used the word unauthorized about a dozen times, but the room had shifted and she could feel it. You could see it in the way she kept adjusting the folder in front of her, picking it up and setting it back down, a small fidgety tell from someone who was usually very still. After the meeting, Sandra came up to me privately near the coffee setup in the back of the room. She was in her early 40s, worked in insurance according to the brief conversation we had, and she told me that she had joined the board 8 months ago thinking it would be a good way to contribute to the community, and that she had been uncomfortable with several decisions since then, but had not been sure how to act on it. She said the financial records I was requesting were something she had also tried to get a full look at and had been told were in process by Wanda. She asked if she could be kept in the loop on the regulatory process. I gave her my email address and told her she should probably talk to Cheryl. Sandra talked to Cheryl. This was a development that turned out to matter quite a lot, with an actual board member raising internal concerns and supporting the request for transparency. The regulatory complaint became much more serious. The state body assigned it to an investigator. Cheryl told me this was faster than usual and suggested they had seen something in the initial complaint that flagged it for priority review. The small claims court date arrived. It was a cold, clear morning about 6 weeks after the blizzard. The kind of brilliant winter day where the sky is an impossible shade of blue, and everything is covered in the clean crust of old snow that sparkles when the sun hits it. I drove to the courthouse and found a parking spot and went inside and sat in the small claims waiting area with a folder containing my letter, my camera footage on a tablet, the Weather Service emergency alert, the County Emergency Management Advisory, and a printed copy of Section 7, Subsection 4B, with the specific language highlighted in 3 places. Wanda showed up about 10 minutes after I did. She was wearing a very formal coat and carrying a briefcase, which I thought was an interesting choice for small claims court. She did not acknowledge me when she sat down, which was fine by me. When our case was called, the judge, a practical-seeming man in his 60s who had the demeanor of someone who had heard every possible variety of neighbor dispute and was genuinely unshockable, looked at the claim summary and then looked at us both and said, "Snow boots," in a tone that managed to be completely neutral and also deeply expressive at the same time. I presented my case in about 8 minutes. I played the camera footage. I showed the weather advisory. I read the exact language of Section 7, Subsection 4B, and pointed out the words permanent or semi-permanent and visual nuisance. I noted that the boots were on the porch for 29 minutes before the fine notice process was initiated, that it was during a declared emergency weather event, and that the conditions made any aesthetic concern about porch appearance moot given near whiteout visibility. Wanda presented her case. She talked about community standards. She referenced other instances of what she described as my history of noncompliance with HOA guidelines, and she argued that the rule did not include a weather exception. She was organized and articulate, and I could tell she had done this before. The judge asked her one question. He asked her what a permanent or semi-permanent item was in her interpretation. She said it meant items that were left out on an ongoing basis. He asked her to confirm that the boots in this case had been on the porch for approximately 30 minutes. She confirmed that. He looked at her for a moment and then looked down at his notes and said that he was ruling in my favor, that the fine did not meet the language of the cited rule as applied to the facts presented, and that the HOA was directed to refund the fine amount plus the court filing fee. He added, and this is the part I want to be very clear about because it mattered later, that he was noting in the record that the circumstances of the fine suggested enforcement that was disproportionate to the violation, and that if the HOA had a pattern of similar enforcement, the community members had legal avenues to pursue that further. He said it conversationally, like an aside, but he said it in open court, and it went on the record. Cheryl later told me that this kind of judicial observation is sometimes a judge's way of pointing at a door and saying it is not locked. The drive home from the courthouse that day felt very good. The roads were icy in the shaded spots and I took it slow, but I had my sunglasses on and the heat running and the folder of documentation sitting on the passenger seat with the judge's ruling written on top, and I felt the particular satisfaction of having done something the right way and had it come out right. But the story was not quite over. The state regulatory investigation moved at its own pace, which is to say, deliberately. The investigator requested records from the HOA directly and had the legal authority to compel production that I did not have on my own. When those records finally came in, they told a story that was worse than Ted had estimated and worse than I had honestly expected. I learned this through Cheryl and through Sandra, who was cooperating fully with the investigation and kept me informed at the level she was legally able to. The detailed fine ledger showed fine revenue that was meaningfully higher than what had been reported in the member-facing financial summaries over the past 2 years. The gap was not enormous in the grand scheme of things, but it was consistent and it was directional. Money was coming in from fines that was not making it into the reported HOA account balance. The investigator found that a secondary account had been established, an account that was nominally described as an administrative fee processing account, which was not disclosed in any member-facing document and which Wanda was the sole authorized signer on. The money in that account had been used for various expenditures. Some were related to actual HOA business in a technical sense, like payment to a contractor for work on the common areas, but several were not. There were charges to what appeared to be personal accounts. There were payments to vendors the investigator could not match to any HOA work order. There were several cash withdrawals over the course of about 18 months that did not correspond to any documented expense. When I heard this, I sat down. I had started this whole thing angry about snow boots, and it had opened up something that was genuinely serious. The investigator referred the case to the local district attorney's office. This is where it left the HOA regulatory track and entered the criminal track, and it moved faster than I expected once that happened. Misappropriation of HOA funds is not a minor issue. The amounts involved, when added up across the full 18-month period, came to just over $14,000. That is real money. That crossed into felony territory in our state. The district attorney's office contacted Wanda. I was not present for any of that, but I heard from Sandra that she had retained a lawyer quickly. I heard separately, through a combination of neighborhood grapevine and one conversation with Cheryl, who was professionally careful about what she shared, that the investigation included a formal interview process, and that Wanda's lawyer had tried to characterize the secondary account as a legitimate administrative function. That argument did not hold up. The account had never been disclosed to board members, never appeared in any financial report, and had no governing document authorization. Sandra and Brian both provided statements confirming they had no knowledge of the account. About 4 months after the blizzard, on a day that was cold but clear, the kind of late winter day where you can feel spring thinking about arriving even if it has not committed yet, Wanda Dennison was formally charged with misappropriation of funds, breach of fiduciary duty, and financial fraud in connection with her role as HOA violations coordinator. She was arrested, processed, and released on bail. The charges were serious, and the case against her was, by Cheryl's assessment, quite strong given the paper trail. Sandra took over as interim board president while the situation was sorted out. She called a full community meeting within 2 weeks of the charges being filed. This one was packed, even more so than the winter meeting, and the tone was completely different. There was no defensiveness, no folder clutching, no citing rules back at people as a deflection tactic. Sandra presented the situation honestly, walked through what the investigation had found, and laid out the steps the board was taking to clean up the financial mess, including retaining an independent accountant to audit the HOA's full financial history and identify all the affected amounts. She also announced a set of proposed governance reforms, including requiring dual signatures on any HOA expenditure over $500, mandatory annual independent audits, and a new community oversight committee that any member in good standing could join. These reforms went to a community vote and passed with 91% support. Wanda's criminal case moved through the system over the following several months. She eventually pleaded guilty to 2 of the 3 charges as part of a plea agreement. She was sentenced to 2 years of probation, a significant fine, community service hours, and full restitution of the $14,000 to the HOA account. She also, obviously, was removed from the board and from any position of authority within the HOA. The plea agreement included a provision that she could not serve in any fiduciary or organizational authority role for several years. Every homeowner who had paid a fine that the new audit determined was not properly applied under the actual rule language received a refund letter and a check. About 22 households received refunds. The amounts varied. Patricia got her $75 back. Derek got his $200 back. A couple of households got refunds of over $300 for fines they had paid, and not fully contested. In total, the HOA refunded just over $4,000 to community members from the general fund, which felt like both a financial correction and a symbolic one. My court-ordered refund of the $150 fine plus the $40 filing fee had already come through before all of this resolved. I got a check in the mail on a Tuesday afternoon in early March, and I put it in my wallet and forgot about it for about a week, which felt like the appropriate level of ceremony for a $190 check that had cost me approximately 3 months of my life. The neighborhood came out of it differently than it went in. I do not mean that in a purely sentimental way, though there was some of that. I mean it practically. People were more engaged with the HOA than they had been. Meetings had real attendance. The oversight committee actually met regularly and reviewed things. Sandra turned out to be a genuinely good board president, the kind who runs a meeting efficiently and treats people like adults and does not invent rules or enforcement positions to suit personal agendas. Ted, who had started this whole thread with his carefully kept spreadsheet, became a member of the Oversight Committee and brought the same meticulous attention to the financial records that he had applied to tracking the problem in the first place. He told me once, in the parking lot of the grocery store after I ran into him in the cereal aisle, that he felt like he had finally found something useful to do with his retirement. I told him that seemed about right. Gloria volunteered to help with the new audit process and brought in a contact from her professional network to assist with the independent review. The full audit was completed by late spring and confirmed what the investigation had found, but also turned up a few smaller discrepancies that had not been part of the criminal case, administrative sloppiness rather than intentional fraud, which were corrected and documented. The audit report was made available to all community members, which was the kind of transparency that should have been happening all along. Mr. and Mrs. Garcia had me over for dinner in April, a proper sit-down meal rather than emergency storm soup, and Mrs. Garcia asked me during dessert whether I had ever imagined when I got that fine notice in the blizzard that it would turn into all of this. I said honestly that no, I had not. I had just been angry about the boots. She laughed and said that was usually how it worked, that the small injustices were the ones that got people moving because they were concrete and personal and impossible to rationalize away. She was right about that. I had not gone looking for a scandal. I had gone looking for $150 and some basic fairness. The rest had been there waiting to be found, and it had gotten found because the situation forced me to start pulling threads. If I had just paid the fine and moved on, which was what Wanda was counting on every resident doing, none of it would have come to light. The whole system depended on people not looking too closely and not thinking it was worth the trouble to fight back. And the thing is, it usually worked. Most people do pay and move on. I understood that. But when enough people stopped doing that, even just a handful with the right combination of documentation and stubbornness and neighbors willing to share information, the whole thing came apart pretty quickly. The boots, by the way, are still the same pair. They are good quality, insulated winter boots that I have had for 4 years and plan to keep for another 4. I store them on the porch mat during winter because I do not want to track snow through my house, and I have done so every morning I have needed to shovel since the blizzard. No one has said anything. No fine notices have appeared on my door. My porch mat is my porch mat and my boots are my boots, and that, at the end of the day, is how it was always supposed to work. Last winter, the first big snow of the season came down on a Thursday night, heavy and fast and beautiful in that hushed blue-dark way that early snowstorms always are. I got up Friday morning before it was fully light, put on my coat and my hat and my gloves, stepped into my snow boots on the porch mat, picked up my shovel, and started clearing the driveway the same way I had the morning all of this began. The street was quiet and white and still. A few other neighbors were out doing the same thing, small moving figures in the early gray light, breath visible, shovels scraping in the cold air. I finished clearing, knocked the snow off my boots against the porch railing, set them on the mat, and went inside to make coffee. Nobody fined me for a single thing.